Hey, so you know how I said in my last wrap up, that was a wrap up of the last 3 months of 2025 because I kind of forgot to do monthly wrap ups, that I was going to get back into monthly wrap ups in 2026? Gotcha. Here I am. We're almost at the end of April. I have done no monthly wrap-ups in 2026 yet, and I have no real excuse except that I've been putting out other content that I'm really excited about and reviewing a lot of the books that I'm reading in other videos. So you're still getting a pretty good idea of what I'm reading, but it's true, I have read other books in these past few months that I have not officially reviewed yet on my channel. So here I am trying to make it up to you. I'm going to review, hopefully relatively concisely, the, I think, 41 books that I read in the first quarter of 2026. That number seems ridiculous, but that's what my Notion reading tracker says, so I guess it's true. Of course, if I have already reviewed a book, especially if I've reviewed a book at length in another video already, I will try to be more concise, and I'll direct you to the video in which I gave a much more in-depth review. I will use my symbol and sound effect combo again to indicate that a book is already included in a reading vlog or a review video, and all those links will be in the description box. So check it out if you want longer reviews of any of those books. And of course, I will also have book cards for all of these books so that you know some basic facts, including the content warnings that I noticed while reading. And when those pop up on the screen, this sound effect will play so that you're aware. And also I have my book cards database that I am trying to keep updated. It should be totally updated to the end of March. So you can also refer to that if you just want to be able to look at all the info at once and refer to it at your leisure. But I think that's all I have to share before we just jump in. So let's just jump in. It feels like it's been a million years since January, but let's go back to the very first book that I finished in January, Whalefall by Daniel Kraus. This I picked up because I kept seeing it recommended in horror subreddits especially, but also talked about in general as a horror or thriller that people really enjoyed that dealt with themes of grief, and also I thought might be good for me as someone who is a little thalassophobic, has a pretty major discomfort, if not serious fear. If I'm being honest, it's a serious fear of large bodies of water. Don't ask me how I worked on a cruise ship. I don't want to talk about it. Anyway, I thought that this would be fun, a little scary, and also probably explore a topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is grief. And unfortunately, this book was not what I expected. So the basic premise is that a teenage boy who has grown up his whole life diving and is a pretty experienced diver is going on a mission to search for his father who has gone missing in the ocean. And said teenage diver gets swallowed by a sperm whale. And that's the book. Is he going to escape the sperm whale? Is he gonna die? Is he gonna find his dad? Who knows? Gotta read the book to find out. And I had high expectations. It kind of felt like maybe a combo of Moby Dick and 127 hours. And that's not what I got, unfortunately. This is marketed, to my knowledge, as an adult novel. This did not feel adult to me. Again, nothing wrong with books that are aimed at different age demographics. All ages should have books marketed to them and written for them. I just don't typically reach for YA at this point in my life, and this read very heavily like YA, not only because our protagonist is a teenager and feels very much like a teenager, but also just because of the writing style. It was quite melodramatic, which again, maybe makes sense for a teenager in this kind of a ridiculous situation, being swallowed by a sperm whale. I'd probably be pretty dramatic about it too. But I can't say that it was really to my taste, tone-wise. I also felt like this had a lot of issues with pacing and structure. There was a constant back and forth between what's actually happening in the present moment as our protagonist is swallowed by a whale and his memories of the past, especially interactions with and feelings about his dad and his relationship with his dad. And I just felt like while this can be done really well, in this case, it really cut the tension every time. It was always a cliffhanger, big moment that we would cut away from and then have a long, slow memory of an interaction or conversation or moment with his dad. And some of them were more interesting than others. Some of them deepened the character development more than others, but all of them cut the tension to the point where I felt like I was being edged by the book repeatedly. And that is not something that I typically appreciate from my fiction. It just felt like we never actually got anywhere because we kept jumping around and we always had to wait a really long time to find out if his next technique to try to escape the whale would work or not. And I just found that kind of annoying, to be totally frank. Felt like it was trying so hard to be literary, and it ended up coming across contrived, clunky, a little juvenile, and very overly dramatic, and also very repetitive and deeply on the nose with its themes. I was perfectly primed for a story about a child losing their father and working through their feelings about their dad and missing their dad, but also being angry at their dad and just dealing with all those complicated, messy feelings and working through grief. That is something that I have actively been working through, specifically losing my dad. And so I think I was very open to reading a book about this topic, and I was very primed to enjoy it and primed to get meaning out of it, and I just didn't. I didn't care about the characters. I wasn't drawn into the relationship. I didn't feel anything other than annoyance reading it. And I'm a big feeler. I feel a lot of feelings. It's not very hard for a book to make me feel emotional. Also, I mean, obviously there's a bit of a level of suspension of disbelief you have to read a book about someone getting swallowed by a whale and not immediately being dead. But this was very implausible, and I really struggled with how long it dragged out and how many things happened that just didn't feel remotely realistic. And the book was framed as being pretty based in reality generally, but just the vast majority of what was happening here did not feel possible. And I'm not an expert on survival after being swallowed by a whale. Maybe it's more possible than it seems, but I just felt he probably should have been dead many, 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 many times over. And I'm not going to spoil anything for you about whether he gets out or not and whether he survives or not. There are just many moments from pretty early on that I feel most humans would be dead, and this kid is not dead. And that doesn't make sense to me, to be totally honest. It also was bringing in a lot of religious themes and more of a spiritual perspective on death. And that is not something that I can personally relate to. And while I can read books that engage with grief and death in that way and get something out of it or appreciate it for what it is, in this case, there just wasn't really anything about the approach to the spirituality that added anything to the experience to me. I didn't feel like it was really saying anything profound or new or particularly interesting. I feel like I'm being so harsh. I'm so sorry. This is our first book out the gate, but unfortunately, it was the first book I read in the year, and I really didn't like it. I gave this book 1 star. I might be in the minority on that. This just really didn't work for me, and I'm sad about it. I'm so sorry to start so negatively, but maybe that weeds out anyone who is unwilling to hear negative reviews because they will be mixed in here. But it's also maybe ripping off the Band-Aid a little bit and getting the bad stuff out at the start, because I really haven't given very many 1-star ratings so far this year, so this is one of the worst of the bunch, and we got it out of the way, so good for us. The next book I finished in January is actually a book that was sent to me directly by an author. So this author, Eric LaRocca, sent me an email and asked if they could send me their book. And I had never read any of their work, but I'd heard about them, especially in horror spaces, and they were very friendly and nice in their email. And I said, sure. And they sent me At Dark, I Become Loathsome. They sent this to me at the end of last winter or last spring. And I started it last spring, and I was making pretty good progress. I think I was about halfway through, and then my dad passed away. And this book deals pretty heavily with grief, and I couldn't read it for a long time. I had to take a very long break, and I felt terrible. I wished I'd been faster about finishing it or picked it up a week earlier or something, so I could have finished it first, because I felt terrible that it took me so long to get around to it, but I just couldn't handle the content freshly in my own grief. And I finally pushed myself to finish it again on my break from work over the holidays. And to be totally honest, I think a lot of my reaction to this is just that I'm not really in the right place to read this book right now. And also maybe that this book just isn't for me. So please take my review with a grain of salt. I mean, always do, because my opinions are just my opinions, and I'm only one person, and my opinions have no more weight than anyone else's, obviously. But in this case, I really feel that it was poor timing on my part, and also just the universe's part, and not anything wrong with the book necessarily, but I just was not in a good place to read it. This is a horror novel, and it's exploring grief primarily. Our protagonist has lost both their wife and their son. Their wife has passed away, and their son is missing. And the novel's exploring his grief and the ways that he is trying to cope with his grief. In most ways, probably most people would agree, not coping very well. And also at the same time, reckoning with his own identity and figuring out how he feels about himself and who he is and his place in the world, and reckoning with his own desire. He is a bisexual man, but has a lot of internalized homophobia and hasn't really come to terms with that part of himself, or at least hadn't before these big losses rocked his life. And then after the losses and being alone suddenly and dealing with this grief, he is starting to explore that side of himself, but it's a bit twisted because he's in a really bad place, because he's grieving really intensely and in a lot of pain. And I'll start with the things that I liked liked about this. I liked the writing overall. I do think there were some aspects of it that were intentionally more stylized and maybe a little bit more contrived, but I don't mean that in a bad way. Just there was a repetitive quality. At dark I become loathsome was a bit of a mantra that was repeated again and again and again, and that repetition was very intentionally used. There is a bit of a very constructed style, and I think that style will really work for some readers and really throw other readers off and kind of drive them away. Generally, I found it interesting. I enjoyed and appreciated that it was trying something and really committing to the bit. It didn't always work for me in every moment, but generally I liked it and I appreciated that it was trying something and trying to be a little bit more rhythmic and lyrical about the storytelling. It almost creates this cyclical trance-like feeling, and I think that works very well most of the time and is very reminiscent of the numbness and sort of never-ending cycle feeling that you can be trapped in when you are grieving. And for that reason, I found it very effective. But again, there were some moments that I wanted to pull that back and have a bit of a more raw, honest openness to the character. And we didn't ever quite get that level of access to him because there was always sort of this layer of artifice. And I don't mean that in a super negative sense. It was just, there was this like performance quality to the writing style, and that did create a bit of a barrier at times, or in some moments where I wanted a little bit more direct, raw access to the protagonist and what he was going through. I do think sometimes it can lean a little bit towards overwroughtness, and it does feel very dreary and dark. And it's meant to, obviously, but that does make it quite heavy to read, especially if you are grieving yourself. Me reading the second half of this, I was not having a great time. And again, a lot of that is my own fault for picking it up, knowing what I was getting, having already read the first half, and sort of exposing myself to that when I wasn't really in the right place for it. But I think for a lot of people, they might never be in the right place for it. I think it's a very particular reader who wants to intentionally subject themselves to this level of dreariness and darkness. It's a lot. I do think the exploration of grief is compelling. I think that was my favorite part of this, but also the part that made it the hardest for me to read. And I do think there are some interesting ideas in here, and some interesting ideas in terms of the exploration of our protagonist's identity and his understanding of himself and his sexuality and his place in the world after going through this kind of a loss. I did struggle, though, on the other side of the coin of that, with the heavy amount of self-loathing and internalized homophobia. That is the point, but it was also really hard to read. Again, a lot of it is just, it's a heavy, dark book, and I was not in a great place to read a heavy, dark book, and I should have known better. Slap myself on the wrist because I did this to myself. There are a couple side stories in here that are pretty disconnected from the main plot that are even darker and drearier and more shocking and disturbing than the main plot line. Some of them have some really graphic sexual and violent content that I found quite shocking. And I read a lot of horror. I would say this is more extreme than my typical horror read and probably past my personal threshold. I really appreciate horror. I really appreciate literary horror. And I would say that this does lean into literary horror, especially because of the writing style and the themes that are being explored. But in terms of its graphic content, it is more extreme than I typically reach for. And I think I found my line, unfortunately. And I think my line is just on the inside of this book. I'm just not sure that I personally can handle it. I am a pretty sensitive person, honestly, especially when it comes to violence. I know that seems silly because I do read a lot of horror, but I can't watch horror movies because I find them too graphic. I find them really upsetting. And with horror novels, I really have to find the balance where I can read graphic content that doesn't really upset me. And sometimes that line is hard to find. But again, I think I might have found it inadvertently in reading this book. Again, please look at the content warnings when the book card pops up for all of the many content warnings with this. If you have questions about specifics, leave a comment down below and I will try to expand from what I can recall now that it's been a couple months, but some of it's pretty vivid in my mind. This is not an easy read. It's not a light read. I would not recommend if you don't typically read horror. And even if you do typically read horror like I do, this might be more extreme than you were expecting, depending on what horror you've read in the past. So just be prepared. You know, this is part of a niche of horror that is transgressive, queer horror and that is using, graphic body horror, graphic sexuality, and transgressive sexuality to explore queer experiences. And I think that that is valid and should exist. And lots of people get a lot out of writing and reading it. But despite the fact that I am bisexual, just like this protagonist, and I read a lot of queer fiction, and I really appreciate queer lit, I'm not sure that this kind of transgressive queer horror is really my niche personally, but if it's something that you enjoy, you might really like this. So all of that being said, while I can see what this was trying to do and I can appreciate aspects of it, it just went too far for me personally. I was not able to really handle and process the content. In general, I think this would have always been hard for me, but especially in the time that I read it, it just wasn't the right pick for me. So I'm giving At Dark, I Become Loathsome 2 stars. Unfortunately for me, I think this is outside of my, not comfort zone, because I read a lot of horror that is outside of my comfort zone and makes me uncomfortable, sort of intentionally so, and I think that can be valuable. This is outside of my realm of being able to process it and still maintain equilibrium with my mental health generally. I was really interested to check out this author's work. And again, they were so nice in their emails. And thank you again for sending me your book. You were very nice if you're watching this. And I'm so sorry I didn't love it, but I hope that my review is able to direct people towards your work who will love it, because there's definitely an audience for this. I think I just might be too sensitive to graphic content to be able to appreciate it fully. So next up, I read My Friends by Frederick Bachman, and this was included in my Goodreads Choice Awards winners video that I do annually. So I'm going to be so brief about this because you can check out that video for a longer review. But basically the premise here is we have a dual timeline where we follow 4 teenagers who have a close friendship, and one of them is a bit of a painting prodigy, and he paints a day where they're all together, and that painting becomes famous. And then we have a modern day timeline where that painter is a little bit older, it's been a few decades, and isn't in the best of health, and that painting is being auctioned. And we have a young character who just got out of the foster care system, just aged out, who's 18, and she has always loved this painting, and she is in the area where the auction is happening and happens to run into the artist's best friend, and they end up going on a journey together, and the artist's best friend tells her the story of their childhood and their friendship and how this painting came to be. And through him telling the story to her, we get to know their story and their friendship. And then we also watch these unlikely friends connect and have their own little adventure together in the modern timeline. And this is literary fiction or contemporary fiction, and it is a book about friendship and different types of friendship, essentially. And while there are aspects of this I liked, and I did end up liking it more in the end than I expected to, based on how much I was struggling and how much I wasn't appreciating it in the first half, I just felt like there were so many aspects of this that felt a little too contrived, not to overuse that word, but a lot of the individual sentences, especially in the dialogue in this book, felt like they were written to be pulled and quoted on Instagram. It felt like lots of truisms and live, laugh, love type quotes just stacked together. And that really made it feel very calculated and not very heartfelt and real. These characters didn't talk anything like they should have based on the characterization we were given. The 18-year-old woman who just graduated out of the foster care system acts and speaks like she's 12 to 14. And our second protagonist, who is 39, speaks and acts like he is 80 to 90 years old. And I am not exaggerating. The dynamic is grumpy grandfather and precocious preteen, except they're supposed to be 18 and 39, and it makes no sense. It makes no sense to me. Again, by the end, I liked the book more than I thought I would, but part of that is that I just let go of the fact that it made no sense that this 18-year-old was acting like she was 12 and this 39-year-old was acting like he was 90. I just decided to accept that these are who these characters are, even if it is very implausible. And I ended up appreciating their sort of unlikely friendship and the story of the past timeline, which was quite endearing and sweet. It brought tears to my eyes at least once near the end, but it also felt like it was trying really hard to make me cry, and that kind of annoys me. So at the end of the day, I landed somewhere in the middle here, and I gave My Friends 3 stars. Next up, I read a poetry collection, Load Poems Like Guns, which was compiled, edited, and translated by Farzana Marie, and I loved this. I read this for my Read It or Haul It challenge. This is a poetry collection focusing on female poets from Herat, Afghanistan, and specifically this collection came to be because of the translator's interest in one specific female poet from Herat who is quite famous, Nadia Adjuman, who was tragically killed very young, but her poetry inspired her peers and is quite well regarded in the Herat, especially in the literary community in Herat, which has been a really thriving community even under Taliban rule. I just found the history portion, the introduction, incredibly informative and fascinating. I found the notes on translation throughout really insightful, and it's just sort of one of my niche interests, translation in general, so I really appreciated that. Farzana Marie talking about the difficulties in translating poetry specifically and these poems specifically. And while kind of like any collection, I think, some poems are going to land more with you than others, and that was certainly the case here, but the vast majority of them I found very moving and very beautiful. I was really taken with them. I really appreciated the many different styles and seeing many different poets and the ways in which they're similar, exploring similar themes or relying on similar traditional forms of poetry, but also the ways that they are incredibly unique. And I just found the whole collection really deeply moving and quite heartbreaking, especially because this collection came out before the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, and reading it knowing that these female poets are now living under Taliban rule yet again was really devastating and really made everything just land heavier with me. But I really felt that it was so worth the time to read this and to read it very slowly. I took over a month to read it. I intentionally delayed my challenge so I could take more time with it. And I'm really glad I did, and I would highly, highly recommend it. I just found this very, very much worth my time, and it's something that I'm going to come back to again and again. Load Poems Like Guns was a 5-star read for me, and I would highly, highly recommend. I forgot to hold this up while I was talking, but this is the collection. You can see I had a lot of thoughts and feelings because I tabbed quite a bit. So next up, I read Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and this was also for my Goodreads Choice Awards video. But basically the premise here, we're following our protagonist who is one of the first women to be accepted into the NASA space program as a future astronaut. She's in the first cohort in the 70s of female astronauts, and she is training to become an astronaut, and she happens to fall in love with another female astronaut and the complications of being queer at a time where it wasn't accepted to be openly queer and their jobs would be at risk if they were open about their relationship. I liked it more than I expected to. There were a lot of aspects of this that I liked a lot. I found our protagonist a bit of a Mary Sue, but I still liked her. I really appreciated her relationship with her niece. I thought that was really well done. Maybe I'm just in my feels because I recently became an aunt and I'm really enjoying being an aunt. I also really liked the development of their relationship. I liked both members of this relationship. I thought the development of their romance was really sweet and endearing. I think the main thing that was missing for me was the actual space program, training to be an astronaut, and also going to space portion that felt sort of brushed under the rug, which is odd because I definitely thought that would be the primary focus of this novel, and it was definitely not, which is fine. I guess. It just felt like something was missing there. I did find the ending very abrupt. I was sobbing, feeling so many emotions, and then it was just over. I found that jarring. There was also more God talk in this book than I typically prefer as an atheist. It was fine, but just not really my thing. But I did like it a lot more than I expected to, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. Maybe a little generous, but overall I had a good time. Next, I finished The Museum of Abandoned Secrets by Oksana Zabushko, who is a Ukrainian author, a contemporary Ukrainian author. And this was our buddy read pick for my buddy read on Patreon. And this is quite a long book. I read it as an ebook, but I think it's over 700 pages, maybe around 800 pages, something like that. It's a bit of a generational story that engages with multiple time periods in Ukrainian history. Basic premise is that a Ukrainian journalist uncovers historical secrets that connect resistance movements from the past to the present in an unexpected way. It's examining the history of resistance in Ukraine and this concept of secrets and hiding things away to keep them safe, and how different generations have continued that tradition, especially because of the instability of living in Ukraine and because of the constant threat from outside. It's been a few months since I finished this, and I still feel quite conflicted about this book. I thought this would be so up my alley when I read the description. I think I actually was the one to nominate this book when we were voting. Unfortunately, it just didn't quite land for me. I think it's a combination of many things, to be honest, and it's something that I have talked about before with translated work. Translating is a very hard thing to do. I applaud translators around the world for what they do. It is so hard. I don't know how they do it. My sister does translation of plays as part of her job. I don't know how she does it. I think it's such an incredible skill, and it's kind of like magic to me, being able to accurately translate something and maintain the flow and the feeling and the style, and also the musicality of the text, all the subtleties, all the subtext, all the undertones, all the feelings that writing can evoke. I just think it's such a complicated thing to do, and to do well. You know, I'm not trying to critique the translator. I have no idea how much of this has to do with the translation and how much of it is just the style that it was originally written in. Unfortunately, I can't read Ukrainian, so I can't read the original to compare, but I found the writing style very opaque. I found it very difficult to read. There are extremely long sentences crossing over a page break or several pages of a single sentence. They sort of jump around and focus on many different things by the time you get to the end of the sentence, or at least for me, I do have ADHD, so that's a factor. But by the end of some of these sentences, I could not remember where we started and what we were initially talking about. I found it very hard to follow, stream of consciousness style, sprawling and impenetrable at times. And some of that is probably my fault. Being someone with ADHD, dealing with a lot of brain fog for the past little bit under a year, and that makes it harder, but I really struggled to follow this. I had to reread so many sections. I found it very frustrating to read. And on top of that, I think because it is so entrenched in Ukrainian culture, which is also what makes it so beautiful and so worth reading, it also makes it hard as an outsider to read because you don't have any of the cultural context needed to understand all of the many references. On the one hand, books are not required to explain everything to an outside audience so they understand every single reference. On the other hand, I do find it really helpful when books have footnotes and just briefly explain what something's referring to, so I have a bit of a jumping off point to research and learn more on my own. And it was enough for me to even get through this brick of a book and do the fair amount of external research I already did to try to understand it. I just didn't have the time to do more, and that left me a little adrift. I am not an expert, so I'm not going to try to explain all of this to you. A member in the Buddy Read did a lot of external research and brought a lot of that research to the table in terms of how living under the Soviet Union had this profound impact on understandings of and expressions of gender, and rebelling against, pushing back against a sort of forced neutrality into these more gender essentialist, as I would frame them, or extreme gender expression as a rebellion against Soviet desexualization. I can understand that while also struggling with the realities of how the female characters are portrayed in the book, and it was something that I really struggled with. There is a really great story in here, and I kept seeing glimpses of it, but I was just so exhausted from the effort of trying to understand it and just read the text and get through it and follow what was happening that I couldn't really appreciate it while I was reading. Your mileage may vary. I would be really curious to know your thoughts if you've read this, especially if you are Ukrainian, your experience of it, because I imagine that if you're Ukrainian, you will get so much more out of this than I did. I personally landed at 3 stars because I think it had a lot to offer. It had a lot to give. I did get a lot out of it still, but it was just such a hard read for me, and I really struggled. Next up, I finished Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This is, I think, considered a novella. I listened to the audiobook, but it was quite short. And in this story, we follow a boy who encounters a ghost, a ghostly presence, who he believes to be his father, who he has never known. And the book is exploring mostly, I would say, grief and identity, and is horror, as is all Stephen Graham Jones that I've read. And While our protagonist is a younger boy, I think he might be a preteen or a young teenager. I just confirmed it in my notes, he is 12, but I would say that the novella is aimed at an adult audience, despite the younger protagonist. I thought that I'd found my favorite ever Stephen Graham Jones when I read The Buffalo Hunter Hunter in 2025, and I still love that book, but this became my favorite. This is the best Stephen Graham Jones I've read, for me personally, in my personal opinion. I thought this was really fantastic and also very emotional. It managed to do so much in so few pages, and that's always something that I am really impressed by when an author can write a really effective short story or novella. I just find that to be really refreshing when books just keep getting longer and longer and longer and longer. I felt like the characters were immediately endearing. I cared about them right away, especially our protagonist and his little brother. I wanted only good things for them, and I was very invested in their well-being and very terrified of anything bad happening to them. I also felt like the characterization of our protagonist's mother was really well done, even though she was more on the sidelines of this particular story. She was also a very interesting character and really enhanced the dynamic. And I don't want to spoil anything because, again, this is quite short, but I did find this quite intense. I found it very emotional. I found it quite terrifying in moments. There are some images and aspects to this that I found very unsettling to read, but I also felt that, like I said, the characterization was amazing, but the themes being explored really hit home for me, and I thought they were really well handled. You know, themes of grief, generational trauma, trying to avoid becoming your parent, but then kind of turning into your own parent inadvertently or not being able to escape that cycle. What we're willing to do, what we're willing to sacrifice, who we're willing to sacrifice to care for, to protect the people we love. Familial relationships, different flavors of familial relationships, and especially sibling relationships. There was a lot here to dig into. And again, it's very short, but I just found it so profound and emotional and moving and really, really well executed. This is one of those stories that I put on the audiobook and then I could not stop it till it was done. And then I finished it and I just stared at a wall for a while because it was a lot, but in the best way. And obviously, I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was incredible. Next, I finished Not Quite Dead Yet by Holly Jackson. This was another read for my Goodreads Choice Awards video. And basically, our protagonist gets hit over the head on the night of Halloween, and she doesn't die, but when she goes to the hospital, they say, unfortunately, based on her injuries, she only has a week to live. There is no way she'll survive unless she does a very risky surgery that she doesn't want to do. So the rest of the book is following her in her last week to live before she dies from the injuries she sustained, trying to figure out who attacked her on the night of Halloween so she can make sure that whoever killed her gets punished. And I thought that this was kind of a fun concept. I'm sure it's been done before, but I have not personally read a book where a character is investigating their own murder like this. And I loved the idea of it, but I hated the execution so much. I did not like our protagonist at all. She was so annoying. Her and her best friend, her sidekick, acted like they were 12 years old, even though they were in their 20s. Not only was she very juvenile and annoying, but she also was very mean to her family, who were understandably pretty upset about the fact that she was going to die in a week. She did not want to spend any time with them, and she also had zero interest in even having a single discussion about possibly trying the surgery that could save her life. And when her mom was upset about that, she acted like her mom was being totally unreasonable, which I think is wild, because if someone I loved was definitely going to die in a week, but there was a surgery that could save them that was very, very risky and had a high chance of killing them, but maybe could save them, but they were definitely going to die in a week anyway, I would 100% be begging them to try the surgery for that chance that they would survive, right? Like, that's not an unreasonable thing, is it? To at least try to ask someone to consider. It's not like her mom was trying to force her, but she just wanted to know why her daughter wouldn't even think about it. Anyway, I'm stuck on that clearly. The whole story felt very YA. It was very repetitive. There were some logic questions, some plot holes, some sort of cartoonishly evil characters and moments. It didn't work for me. I didn't like absolutely despise it. It wasn't the most offensive thing I've ever read in my life or something. I just really didn't have a good time. So I gave it 2 stars. And I'm gonna move on. Next up, I finished our December book club pick. I always finish our book club picks at the start of the next month because our discussions are at the start of the next month and I like to have it fresh, which was Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. This was actually a reread. I have read this book before 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. And I actually enjoyed this more on a reread than the first time, which was fun. I feel like that's not always the case, but I was excited for that to happen this time. And this is a fantasy story that takes place in a pre-Columbian inspired world, and a solar eclipse is approaching, and there's a lot of religious significance, cultural significance tied to a solar eclipse. And we're following our two protagonists who have very distinct and different roles in what's to come, and they sort of happen to meet each other unexpectedly and connect. And it's an epic fantasy, indigenous inspired culture, several queer characters, including one of our protagonists who is bisexual. And like I said, I liked this even more than the first time I read it. The first time I read it, I think I gave it 4 stars, and this time I gave it 5 stars. I love the setting. I love the political world building. I love the religions and the way they intertwine. I love the magic and the different sort of creatures, species of people in this world and their various powers and how they interact. I loved all the details of the foods in different places and the terrain. It was just very rich and well imagined and immersive. It could get a little bit info dumpy at times, but it didn't bother me too much because I just found all the information so interesting and I was soaking it all up. I also loved all the main characters that we were following. All of them are isolated in different ways. Some of them are, alone in a crowd, and some of them are literally very alone and spend a lot of their lives alone. And they're each seeking connection and true connection, someone that they can really trust. In a world full of political intrigue and danger and complexity, I loved how much varied queer rep there was in this book, both gender and sexuality representation. I also felt like the pacing and the overall structure was unique, and while I found it quite driving and immersive and easy to follow along with, it really made me want to keep reading constantly and not put it down. It also sort of feels like a book cut in half, in that it almost feels like with the sequel, which I have not read yet. I meant to right away and then I forgot to get around to it, but it feels like the next book in the series should have been the second half of this book. I mean, I haven't read it yet, but this book ends very abruptly, and it does feel extremely sudden and a bit jarring, but even still, I really liked it. Like I said, I think it was even better the second time around. I really liked our protagonists. I thought they were fantastic characters. I was really invested in their story. The world was so rich and interesting. And this is reminding me now, talking about it, that I really should pick up the next book because I want to know what happens next. I'm very invested. I got distracted with a million other books, but I'm going to go read them now. Liked the explorations of religion and power. Really liked the main romantic relationship that's explored. Had a really good time. 5 stars for Black Sun. I'm excited to read the next one. Fevered Star, I think it's called. Next up, I read another winner of the Goodreads Choice Awards, Fake Skating by Lynn Painter. This is a YA romance about childhood friends who have been living apart for a long time and are now living in the same town again and had a bit of a falling out and have to fake date for reasons. And I really didn't like this. I didn't like this at all. Didn't like the characters, didn't like the romance. I don't want to repeat myself too much because I went on a rant in the Goodreads Choice Awards video, but the swearing is so unnecessarily excessive. It is wild how much these characters swear. There's way more swearing in this book than any other book I've read this year. I would pretty much guarantee it to you. Maybe the exception would be Brimstone by Kelly Hart, which I'm not going to talk about in this video because I read it in April. The swearing is ridiculous in general for any book, but in a YA book for teenagers, it's too much. It's too much. I did not enjoy this book for so many reasons, but the swearing really stands out to me as absolutely ridiculous. I think this is being adapted. Why? This was a 1-star read for me. Go watch my Goodreads video if you want more thoughts, because I just don't want to get into it again, but yikes, no. Next, I read another winner for the Goodreads Choice Awards, the winner in the horror category, which was Witchcraft for Wayward Girls. What a mouthful, by Grady Hendrix, and I really didn't like this as well. Another one I went on a long rant on in the Goodreads Choice Awards video, mostly to do with Grady Hendrix's whole career as a cis man, mostly writing stories about women and women suffering, profiting off of women suffering. Not my favorite thing ever. And go check out that video if you want me to get much more into depth on that and also review this book. Honestly, I don't want to review it again. I thought it was very poorly done. The witches didn't need to be there. I didn't think this book handled the subject matter very well. I didn't enjoy reading it. I think it's worth exploring and I understand why it feels important and timely, but I don't think that Grady Hendrix was the person to write this story and I didn't feel it was well executed personally. 1 star. Go watch that other video if you want more thoughts. I can't go through it again, okay? I can't do it to myself. Then I finished The House of My Mother by Sherry Frankie. This is a memoir, and it won Best Memoir for the Goodreads Choice Awards. And this was fine. I found it interesting. I found it relatively well written. It is a memoir about Sherry's experience growing up with an abusive mother and in this high control household and as devout Mormons. She is still Mormon to my understanding, so this is not a critique of Mormonism. You know, it's hard to talk about memoirs because people's experiences are people's experiences, and people's lived experiences deserve to be shared if they want to share them. This felt a little rushed out. The timeline is very fast from when everything happened to when this book came out, and Sherry is very young still, and I felt a little bit of a lack of distance in the ways that Sherry talked about her experiences, and I think it would have been a more impactful read for me personally, and also possibly a more healing experience for Sherry to write it with more time and more perspective. And that's something I've brought up before with other memoirs. I just personally am more a fan of memoirs that are written a little bit later with more time to reflect and process the trauma and the experiences. I think they tend to be more reflective and have more to say. At the end of the day, I thought this was a good memoir, but I didn't think it was exceptional. In terms of the craft of writing a memoir, I'm not judging whether her life is good or exceptional or if her story deserves to be told, because of course it does. But in terms of this being a book and my experience reading it, I thought it was good and I gave it 3 stars. But I do think some things were missing or underexplored, mostly for the reason of not having enough time and distance to fully process things. And I talk about that more in depth in the Goodreads video, if you want more context for that. Then I read The Compound by Aisling Rawle. Thank you to those who corrected my pronunciation. I got it wrong in the Goodreads video. It's Aisling, an Irish author, and this was the winner of the sci-fi category. The concept is basically Love Island meets Lord of the Flies, kind of. If you know Love Island, then you know. This is like Love Island if it was much more dystopian than it already is, and also dangerous as all hell. And I liked it a lot. Again, I get into more details in the Goodreads video, but it is a bit dreary and detached. It's sort of sad girl lit coded. Our protagonist is very disconnected and sort of calculated, but I found her to be really interesting and I found it quite engaging and immersive. I read it very quickly. I thought it was a really interesting premise and I thought it was executed quite well. I did not super love the bisexual representation. I thought it was a little shoved in there without actually being true representation, which irks me a little. It wasn't offensive or anything. I didn't find it problematic or something. It didn't really feel like it served a purpose being there. And it kind of annoyed me that we were told that these characters were bi, but then we didn't really get any true, genuine representation. I also thought it was going to get more unhinged than it did get, and I was waiting for that. It didn't quite go as far as I expected it to. But overall, I found it really quite entrancing, and I stayed up really late to finish it, and I gave it 4 stars. So that's The Compound. Then I finished Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green, and this is a nonfiction book about tuberculosis and the history of tuberculosis and how it's tied to so many things. I thought it was fascinating. Again, I go into much more detail in my Goodreads Choice video, but I liked this a lot. I really enjoyed it. Just like I enjoyed John Green's last nonfiction. I have never read any of John Green's fiction, but I've enjoyed his nonfiction, and this was no different. I gave it 5 stars. Thought it was really interesting and also made me cry a couple times. Then I read The Names by Florence Knapp. This was the runner-up in the debut category, but I chose to read it instead of the winner. This is literary fiction near historical fiction. It starts in the 80s, which I don't know when we start defining things as historical fiction versus contemporary. The 80s were unfortunately nearing 50 years ago now. I know none of us want to reckon with that reality, but it's true. Anyway, The Names is the story of a woman named Cora who has just given birth to a baby boy, her 2nd child, and she's on the way to the registrar's office to register her baby and give her baby a name. The story follows 3 different paths that her life and her children's lives can take depending on which name she gives the baby. Either the name her husband wanted, which was his own name, making him a junior, the name that she wanted, that she'd been sort of dreaming of or felt fit her newborn baby, or the name that her daughter would have picked for her little brother. And I found this really moving and impactful. It deals with some difficult subject matter, especially domestic violence and abuse abuse in a marriage and coercive control, financial abuse, emotional, verbal abuse, as well as physical abuse. It was quite harrowing at times, and there were a lot of really difficult moments. Like I said, we follow basically the lifetime of this boy in 3 different versions of his life, depending on what his name is. And it's really exploring this concept of nominative determinism and how our names can really shape our lives. And a lot of difficult and heartbreaking things happen in a lifetime, and we watch it 3 times. So there's a lot, but I also found it moving and endearing and hopeful and full of love and tenderness and genuine emotion and vulnerability. And I thought the characters were really well done. The relationships were really well done. The writing was quite lovely, and I just really loved it at the end of the day. It made me really emotional. I thought it was fascinating and heartbreaking, and also heartwarming. That's the word. And I give it 5 stars. And I know what you're thinking. Are we still in January? Yes, we are. Yeah, I'm not done January yet. I know, I read a lot of books in January. What was I thinking? I don't know. I was on a rampage. Next, I finished How to Kill a Witch by Zoe Venditazzi and Claire Mitchell. This was the winner of the History and Biography category, and it's specifically talking about the history of witches and witch trials in Scotland. And I found this really interesting. It was a different take on witches than I have personally read about. I mean, I think a lot of people, at least in North America, have largely been exposed to stories about witch trials set in Salem. And so it was really interesting to get a different perspective. And I felt like it covered a lot of aspects of the experience of being a woman during this time period and the reasons behind accusing women of witchcraft and of how these witch trials proceeded and the realities of them, not this sort of glamorized Hollywood version of them, I suppose, that I found really quite interesting to read. And I personally gave it 5 stars. I thought it was really fascinating and would recommend. Then I read In the House in the Dark of the Woods by Laird Hunt. This was a Read It or Haul It pick. And this is a pretty short story, a novella that is very fairy tale-like. And we're following a woman who ventures into the woods to collect some berries and things and becomes lost in a surreal, folkloric nightmare and tries to get back to her husband and son. And things get weird. Pretty quick. I liked a lot about this. I would consider this literary horror. I forgot to hold it. I have the book, obviously, because I read it for my Read It or Haul It challenge, which is all about reading down my physical TBR. I found the tone of it really interesting, this sort of folklore fairy tale style of it. And I thought the themes that were being explored to do with womanhood and women's roles and the difficulty of existing in the world as a woman and as a mother and as a wife, especially in a time period that was very unequal, and also tying into sort of these fairy tale archetypes of the maiden, the mother, and the crone, bringing those into sort of fairy tales to do with dangerous, dark woods that you're going to get lost in or corrupted in somehow, were all very interesting. This is another one, kind of like The Compound, where I was expecting it to get a little bit more unhinged than it got. It definitely gets... There are some moments, but I expected it to go a little further than it did. And I also felt that it was maybe a little bit more meandering and plotless. I mean, I don't mind plotless books. I read them and sometimes I love them. In this case, I wanted a touch more, maybe not of plot, but of at least explicit exploration of its themes. I felt like I could pick up on what it was trying to explore, what I felt it was trying to explore, but I felt a little bit like I was pulling teeth trying to get the meaning out of it. It was very vague and I wanted a little bit more from it, but I did like it a lot. I ended up giving it 4 stars, but I do have a longer review, including spoilers, in my other video, if you want to watch that. Next, I read book 2 in I think it's the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, which starts with Jasmine Throne by Tasha Suri, the Oleander Sword. This is continuing the story of our 2 protagonists from book 1. And this is a pretty heavily political intrigue sort of fantasy with a sapphic romance at the center, and also has some really interesting world building, multiple religions that exist in this world, and to the magic. And I unfortunately did not like this second book as much as I liked book 1. I still liked a lot about it, but I did find it very slow and kind of boring in the first half. I really wanted to be as immersed in it as I was immersed in book one, but it just was kind of not capturing my attention as much. The second half did pick up quite a bit, but I also felt like our sapphic romance that I really loved in book one. I thought that their chemistry was amazing. I loved both characters. I thought their dynamic was great. In book two, I felt like the magic was lost a little bit. I couldn't feel their chemistry as much. I don't know, something was missing for me. I did still love the world building, the magic systems, the religion. I thought it was all very well handled and unique and fascinating, and that really kept me going. But it did very strongly feel like a second book in a trilogy where things sort of lag as we set up for the conclusion. And I always find that a bit frustrating. So I liked this a lot, but I struggled a lot more to stay engaged than I did with book one. Yeah. This was a 3-star read for me. Still good. I would still recommend it and the trilogy as a whole, but a little bit of a letdown from what I was hoping for after how much I enjoyed book one. Then the final 2 books I read in January were the 2 prequels of the Hunger Games series. And again, I read those for the Goodreads Choice Awards video. But I gave both of these 5 stars, and I'm going to try to be concise because, again, I read so many books in January and I've been talking for ages and we're only just getting to the end of the first month of 3. So I really liked both of these. I read these not having reread the original trilogy since the first time I read them when I was a teenager. I have since corrected that. I reread the trilogy after almost 20 years and I made a reading vlog, so you can watch that. I'll link it down below if you're interested. But I really loved both of these prequels. Like I said, I gave them both 5 stars. I thought they were well written. I liked the characters. I continued to like the themes that are being explored through this Hunger Games world, through the series. I really appreciated the world building, as always, and I thought that the characters in both of these books were just as strong and just as engaging to me and just as endearing and lovable and forced me to feel strong protective feelings for them as I felt for the characters in the original trilogy, and I thought they were both great. Okay, that behemoth of a reading month is behind us. In February, I read fewer books, and March, I read even fewer books, but I am going to try to be a little bit faster because, good Lord, I've been talking for a long time already. This video is going to be massive. The first book I finished in February was Noli Me Tangere by Jose Rizal. I know I'm not great at pronouncing the Latin title. This is known as the novel of the Philippines, and it was the first official book that I landed on for my Reading Around the World challenge that I sort of kicked into high gear again this year. Technically, I think this was the 42nd book that I've read for this challenge, but the first that I am documenting in this way, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I totally understand why it is known as the great novel of the Philippines. I understand why it inspired a revolution and led to the Philippines becoming independent from Spanish colonialism, and it's really fantastically done and very, very, very relevant to read right now, despite the fact that it was written in the late 1800s. It's masterfully done. It's fantastic. I'm very excited to read the sequel. 5 stars. Go watch the reading vlog if you want a longer review. Next was our book club pick for January, which was another reread, The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I've already reviewed The Secret History and talked about it a few times on my channel, so I'm going to be very brief. I love this book. It is very pretentious, but purposefully so. For effect, part of what it's doing is commenting on the futility of this sort of self-absorbed pretension, especially in very young adults who don't have a lot of perspective on the world yet. And it's the story of an elite group of classmates at a Ivy League school who are studying the classics, ancient Greek, and they get embroiled in a murder. And that's all I'll say about that. If you somehow haven't had The Secret History spoiled for you and you haven't read it, I think The Secret History is pretty divisive. Some people really hate this book. It is pretentious, but again, that's kind of part of the point. It is sometimes touted as the book that started dark academia, the initial dark academia book. There are problems with it for sure. It is not a perfect book, but I do love it. I do love it. All the characters suck, every single one. You won't like any of them. And if that sounds terrible to you, I would not read this book. And I forgot to hold it while I talked about it, but I do own this book as well. And I've now read it and annotated it twice over. So that's fun. Next up, and I'm remembering to hold the book while I talk about it this time, was another book for my Read It or Unhaul It challenge, a graphic novel this time, Night Eaters by Marjorie Liu and illustrated by Sana Takeda. This is the same team that does Monstrous, which is my favorite graphic novel series. It's back here somewhere, which is why I'm waving my arm. And this is the first volume in a new series, and I loved this so much. Again, this is included in a reading vlog, so go check that out for a much longer review. But this is fantastic. It's mostly set in 2020 in New York City, but it also has some flashbacks to Hong Kong in the 60s, and I think a brief flash to Hawaii in the 90s, roughly. And we're following adult children of immigrant parents who discover that their parents have been hiding a pretty big secret. And this was endearing and hilarious and very creepy at times and really great. And I loved it a lot, and I gave it 5 stars, and I'm very excited to read the next volume. And I would highly recommend this team if you're looking for some horror graphic novels to pick up. I think they're a fantastic team. I adore Sana Takeda's art so much, and I love Marjorie Liu's writing. And this was no different. So, loved The Night Eaters. It was so good. Next, I read an arc that was sent to me by the publisher, I'll Make a Spectacle of You by Beatrice Winifred Eaker. And I really wanted to like this more than I did. This setup was so perfect for me in every possible way. And then the execution just fell a little flat for me, and I was really sad about it. The premise here is that we're following our protagonist, Zora, who is a graduate student, and she's in the Appalachian Studies department at HBCU. And she finds this old diary in the library where she's able to read about some historical experiences on this campus. And students are going missing, and there's folklore around a presence in the woods that is dangerous. Our protagonist is investigating, and she's a lesbian, and there's some other queer representation in the book as well. This just felt like such a perfect setup for me. Horror novel in an academic setting with a bit of an older protagonist. Unfortunately, I found the execution just a little uneven, and while I did like a lot of aspects of this, I found it quite eerie and creepy. I liked our protagonist a lot. I liked the setting a lot. I think there were lots of interesting factors and some really cool ideas and reveals. I also felt like it was a little bit info dumpy at times, while also kind of not explaining a number of things that I really wanted to know more about or felt like they should have been explained at some point. I also felt like the pacing was quite rushed, where it feels like everything is happening in a few days or a week. And I think it's maybe meant to be a few weeks, but everything just feels at a breakneck pace to the point where I kind of felt like I couldn't fully settle into the story or get used to the characters and their relationships and the setting. I wanted to sit in it a little bit more. I felt like I was being rushed along. I also felt like more was being revealed in the flashbacks about what was happening than we were getting in first person from our protagonist's point of view. And I wanted our protagonist to be discovering more of this firsthand so that we as the reader could be experiencing more firsthand instead of having so much of it explained to us in the past in these flashbacks. Something about that sort of drained the tension a little bit for me. I think maybe it was just a little ambitious in its scope for a debut novel. It was trying to do a lot of things, and it did quite a few of those things really well, but I think it was juggling so many things at once. Honestly, I think most authors would struggle with all the different things that this was trying to do. And while I really liked many aspects of it, by the end, I was feeling really frustrated by some of the unanswered questions and the pacing and some of the decisions that were being made, especially by our protagonist. That thing that happens in some stories where the protagonist makes decisions that just don't feel in line with their characterization, but it's what needs to happen for the plot to happen. And that can be frustrating as a reader when you feel like the character is more of a plot device than a person. And for the most part, Zora was a person in her own right, and I really liked her, but then there were times where her decisions made no sense. And while this wasn't a perfect read for me, I would recommend it. Especially, I think this would be really good for newer readers to horror, if only because the actual horror level, like the scare levels, are quite low. And I'm trying to remember, I don't think there's really any gore at all, but also a really interesting premise and does have that eerie atmosphere. And I am very interested and excited to see what this author does next. I think there were so many cool ideas in here, and lots of things were executed in a really interesting way. So I am looking forward to seeing what she does next, and I will pick up her next novel. But this was a 3-star read for me. Next up, I finished the Burning Kingdoms trilogy by Tasha Suri that started with The Jasmine Throne and then the Oleander Sword, and the last book is The Lotus Empire. I liked The Lotus Empire more than the Oleander Sword, but still not quite as much as The Jasmine Throne, the first book. This was also much more slowly paced, sort of similar to book 2 in its pacing. I mean, book 1 wasn't super fast paced either, but it felt a little bit more balanced, I guess, in its pacing, and I didn't feel the slowness as much in book 1. I felt it a lot in book 2 and 3. I found there to be a lot more point of view switches in this book in particular, and there are quite a few, again, in the earlier books, but in this book it felt a little excessive and sort of to the book's detriment, where we couldn't ever quite settle into one perspective because there were so many. And it did happen a few times in the earlier books where we would have a one-off point of view for a character that's barely in the book and then never shows up again. And I just thought we could probably learn that from a character we already know instead of trying to get accustomed to a new point of view character. But I felt like that problem sort of escalated as the series went on. Still loved the world building and the magic and the religion and the political intrigue. All of that was great. Still kind of felt like Priya and Malini, our two protagonists from book 1, lost their spark. I didn't feel like they regained it even in book 3. They just kind of felt like slightly different characters. And again, their chemistry, their dynamic together didn't reach the same heights that they had in book 1 for me. I felt like in book 2 and then in book 3 as well, Bhumika became the most interesting character to me. But in book 3, she felt very underutilized, and some of the situations that come up, some of the choices the author makes in terms of the plot to do with Bhumika and her role in the plot also really heavily reduce her importance to the story in a way that I found kind of frustrating because she became my favorite character. I'm feeling conflicted now because I'm like, did I really like book 3 more than book 2? I don't know. I think both of them were very similar experiences for me, and both of them were a bit of a letdown from how much I liked book 1 and how much potential I felt this world and these characters and this series had in book 1. It didn't really go quite in the direction I expected it to, and I felt like a lot of the potential was left on the table. It wasn't terrible by any means. I still found it interesting. I still liked the characters and wanted to follow what happened with them. And again, the world building was amazing. It just felt like something was missing. The spark was missing a bit. So this was another 3-star read for me. Again, I would still recommend the trilogy. I think it's worth reading for the world building and the magic system and the way the religions are tied into it alone. All of that is really cool and really well done. And they're interesting reads regardless. But I do think that book 1 is the best book of the trilogy, which is a little too bad. Okay, next up I read a book that has been all over the place, at least on my feeds in the last year, which was Chain Gang All-Stars by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And this is sort of sci-fi, near future or contemporary dystopia, reimagining the prison system in the United States, a bit of a Gladiator-inspired reality TV show where prisoners fight to the death on TV. It seems like most people who I follow along with and whose feelings about books I typically agree with loved this book. And while I can see why, and there are a lot of aspects of this I really, really liked, I just felt like this fell a little bit flat for me in terms of its actual thematic exploration of the prison system. The system within this book is so far removed from the actual prison system that currently exists in the US, at least my understanding of it as someone who is not American, that it doesn't really work as a critique of the current prison system as it exists for me personally. It's too removed from that. It is a completely different thing. But it had these footnotes throughout that were referring to the real life, current day US prison system and sharing facts, statistics about it that felt very removed from the story that was being told. Maybe including those footnotes and those details in an introduction or in an author's note at the end would have allowed the author to share those facts and bring the ideas in the book to reality and show some of the similarities would have maybe worked better for me than interrupting the flow with footnotes. I don't know if I'm explaining that as well as I would like to, but I just felt like, for me personally, it felt like it was trying to do two very different things, and I'm not sure that they ever quite coalesced in the way that I was hoping for. I think the writing was quite beautiful. I think the characters were really interesting. I think the system, as was explored, was quite visceral and intense and makes you think and feel a lot of things. It deals with some really complicated issues around morality and guilt and redemption, and I think that it does so in a really interesting way, in a really poignant way. I did feel sometimes, kind of like with the Burning Kingdom series, where there were maybe a few too many points of view, and there were times where I wished we'd kept the scope a little bit smaller so we could spend more time with a slightly smaller number of characters. There's quite a large cast of characters, and there are times when it feels more like a collected string of vignettes or even a collection of short stories within a world rather than one solid novel. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it did feel a touch fragmented at times. I did think the writing was beautiful in general on a sentence to sentence level. I went into this expecting a brand new favorite, 5 stars, and unfortunately it wasn't quite that for me, but it was very good. So I'm giving it 4 stars. Next, I picked up another book for my Reading Around the World challenge for Haiti, Hadriana dans tous mes rêves by René Despestre, reviewed in my recent reading vlog. And this is the story of a Haitian woman who dies at the altar on her wedding day and is turned into a zombie. And that's all I'll say about the premise. I don't want to spoil anything for you. I ended up really liking this a lot. I read it in French, which was quite a challenge because of all the Haitian vocabulary that I wasn't familiar with, but I found this book so fascinating. I loved the ways that it used the Haitian zombie to explore its themes. It was definitely a little bit more lacking in the plot department than I expected, and it did feel a little bit like something was missing for me in that area, but otherwise I really enjoyed it. I found it super interesting, and I gave it 4 stars. Then I picked up a romance. I don't read contemporary romance very often. It's not my favorite genre, but occasionally from time to time I get in the mood for a little bit of love and I pick up a romance, and I did that in February, the month of love, and I tried The Princess Trap by Talia Hibbert because I have really enjoyed Talia Hibbert's romances in the past. I read her whole Brown Sisters trilogy, loved all 3. I also read her YA romance, Highly Suspicious and Unfairly Cute, I think is what it's called, which was very cute, as the name would imply. So I thought I'd try The Princess Trap. And the premise here is that a prince and a woman who works in HR at a fancy prep school get entangled in a bit of a scandalous situation and get photographed. And to try to escape the scandal, they have to pretend to be engaged. And that gets a little complicated. I felt pretty mixed about this. On the one hand, I really liked both of the characters. Both protagonists were great as people. I found them really endearing. I liked them a lot. I thought their dynamic was great. They had a lot of banter and chemistry. I was really excited for it at the start and felt like it was going to be really electric between them, and that I was really going to be, giggling and kicking my feet because I thought they were really sweet and interesting. But then I struggled a bit once their relationship escalated a little bit more. As much as I liked the male love interest, the male protagonist, and I did like him, I think he was an interesting character and he was likable, he did sort of have this objectifying way of thinking about the female protagonist that I didn't love. There was something a little smarmy about his internal monologue, especially in the way he talked about or looked at her body, that I found yeah, I'm glad that he was attracted to her and that's good, but something about the tone of it threw me off a little bit, I guess. I hate good girl being used in the bedroom. Good girl is used in the bedroom in this book repeatedly. I hate that so much. It gives me the ick. Please no. I need warnings when books have good girl in sex scenes. I also found their dynamic, while I was glad that it was very consent driven and they seemed to both get a lot of pleasure from it, and I'm happy for them. Their kinks were not my kinks in particular, and their dynamic was very dom sub sort of heavy in a way that it doesn't appeal to me necessarily. So the spicy scenes weren't to my taste. And I do know that sites like romance.io exist, and I really should get in the habit of looking at them to see what all the tags are before I pick up a book. But I do wish books were marketed more clearly with the kind of dynamics they have, and if there are kinks involved and things, so that people can self-select for the books that they're interested in. Because there's nothing wrong with any of the kinks that are in this book. They're all totally fine. People can enjoy them and should with consenting partners. I would rather spend my time reading a romance that is more my thing, I really like Talia Hibbert's writing style. I did think the romance part of this was really endearing and lovely. This is a pretty short book, but the end was very sudden, and there were some more dark or complex themes being explored that I thought were being explored quite well early on, but then everything had to sort of escalate and be wrapped up very suddenly. And that, I think, was a bit of a disservice to some of the themes being explored. So for me, this was good, but not great. It was a 3-star read. I prefer Talia Hibbert's other romances. I will keep trying her romance because I do really like how she writes characters and romance. This one just wasn't for me, and I need to remember to check romance.io because maybe authors won't warn me, but I can try to find that information first. I just always forget. I don't read a lot of romance, so when it comes around again, I often forget to check those things, but I need to remember. Then I read a thriller, which I also don't read super often. I was kind of having fun with genres in February, trying different things, but I read One of Us Knows by Alyssa Cole, and I have read from Alyssa Cole before and enjoyed her work. My favorite book of hers is actually a historical romance, a historical sapphic romance, and this is a book about a woman our protagonist has DID, dissociative identity disorder, and she has been hired to work on a secluded island. And things are not as they seem and possibly more dangerous than predicted. And also maybe there are things to be uncovered in her memory that she has been repressing that maybe do or don't have to do with this island. Was that cagey enough for you? I don't know. I thought that the premise was really interesting. I don't know a huge amount about DID, but the little bit that I do know, this felt like well-researched and thoughtful representation. Let me know if you feel otherwise, if you have DID or know more about it than I do and have read this book and felt it was poor representation, please let me know. But it seemed like Alyssa Cole had done research and was trying to be fair and respectful. I did feel like the writing style was a little bit forced quirky at times, quite memey, like internet speak in a way that felt odd for the age of our protagonist. There was something sort of very now or almost like very a couple years ago about it in a way that sort of took me out of the story. Kind of Gen Z coded, even though the protagonist, I think, was in her mid-30s and this was set a few years ago. Some very recent references that felt like references our protagonist wouldn't know based on her circumstances. I also felt like the story was a little bit rushed. The pacing was a bit quick for me. There were some reveals that happened a little too quickly or things that came together a little too conveniently. I also felt like setting this sort of at the tail end of the pandemic was fine, except that because, again, of some of the circumstances here, it ended up being explained again and again, and so many basic details of the pandemic were being explained, and it made sense why they had to be explained to this one particular character, but as a reader, and any reader reading this is going to have lived through the pandemic and vividly remember it, so it became a little tedious for me personally. I did think the setting was very cool and creepy. There was a lot of potential there. I do think the atmosphere could have been more intense. It could have been a more atmospheric read than it was, but there was a little bit of that. And the villains were pretty cartoonish. Not the most cartoonish villains I've ever read, but they were pretty cartoonish. It fell a little short of my expectations, but I did find it to be a fun, quick, easy read. So this was a 3-star read for me. So next up, I read a cozy mystery, Murder in G Major by Alexia Gordon. And the premise here is that we're following a classical musician who is staying in the home of a late Irish composer so she can teach at a local prep school. And the house is haunted by said late Irish composer, who she really respects, and he insists that she solve his murder. So she, as an amateur detective, has to try to solve his murder in this little Irish town where everyone is keeping secrets. And this was also not a totally perfect book for me, but I did like it a lot. I liked the characters a lot. I liked the protagonist. I'm not maybe the biggest ghost person, and this is very like quirky, friendly ghost, which is a little silly, but I liked the ghost. The late Irish composer was a very entertaining character, and I liked their friendship, him and the protagonist. So I kind of enjoyed it, even though it was a little silly and you really have to suspend your disbelief for it. The writing was pretty straightforward, but very engaging. I found the story propulsive and immersive. The setting was enjoyable of this small, close-knit Irish town with lots of secrets. I did feel like the murder and the culprit became pretty clear earlier on in the novel than probably intended. I think from around the halfway point, I was pretty certain who the murderer was, and I ended up being right. So that was a little bit anticlimactic, but also probably better than it totally coming out of left field and there being no justification whatsoever or no hints at all for who the murderer was. I do like that this is a cozy mystery with a Black protagonist written by a Black author. I feel like a lot of cozy mysteries that I have tried have been very white. Very lacking in representation of any kind. And I also feel like a lot of cozy mysteries have an issue with profiling people, which maybe comes with the territory of being an amateur detective. I don't know, but I have been made very uncomfortable by some cozy mysteries I've read in the ways that they make really big assumptions about people based on their gender or their race or their size or their orientation. And this book didn't do that, and I appreciated that a lot, especially our protagonist, who was a Black woman in a tiny Irish town, does not experience racism, and I really appreciated that. I also feel like there was very little, if any, fat phobia or misogyny, which feels like a low bar to clear, but a lot of cozy mystery has an issue with misogyny and fat phobia in my experience. There are some characters in this book that suffer from mental illness. In my opinion, the book was trying to subvert stereotypes around mental illness, but I also can see how some of the choices made, especially in the final confrontation, could be read as playing into or reinforcing negative stereotypes around mental illness. And I think that's really going to depend on the reader and how they interpret it. I personally read it in a more charitable light, and then I read some reviews where people were very angry about the portrayal. So your mileage may vary. I don't think the author was trying to do what some of these really angry reviews were implying. I don't think it was intentional, and I also personally didn't read it that way, but I could see it is a gray area, and I could see where people could read it differently. So maybe tread carefully, or just keep that in mind if you're going to give this a try. I do think cozy mysteries have an issue with stereotyping in general. Like I said, I think this book does far less stereotyping than almost any other cozy mystery I've ever read, but keep it in mind and be warned. I'm really trying not to spoil it for you. I liked this overall. I liked it overall, and I gave it 4 stars. Next up, I finished another book for my Read It or Unhaul It challenge, Severance by Ling Ma. But this is another zombie book. I don't read a lot of zombie books, and 2 isn't that many, but it is weird that it happened twice in 1 month. And this is kind of playing with some similar themes to Hadriana dans tous mes rêves with zombies, but also not. This is definitely more focused on corporate America and hustle culture and immigration, but there are some similar crossover themes, more so than I would have expected. And I thought that the way that zombies were portrayed in this were really interesting. It was a very unique take on a zombie. I loved our protagonist, Candace. I loved following her story. This was much more emotional and vulnerable and tender than I expected it to be. I was very emotional reading it. I was so engaged and so immersed. The way that this book deals with parent-child relationships, especially in an immigrant family, especially tied with grief and expectations of success, all of that tied together, I thought were handled so well and really hit me so hard. I felt so deeply emotional reading, especially about Candace and her parents and their experience immigrating to the US. I also found the modern day, near future, dystopian, apocalyptic zombie, very slow zombie apocalypse fascinating. I also thought this was beautifully written. There are no quotation marks, which I did complain about somewhat at length in my Read It or Unhaul It reading vlog. But overall, this was amazing, and I gave it 5 stars. And the last book I read in March was The Blueprint by Gianna Rashad, and I actually filmed a reading vlog for this, and I have not had time to edit it since I read this. I'm working on it. I still want to share that reading vlog because, I don't know, I think it'll be interesting. So I'm going to try to be concise here, and maybe that will encourage me to finally finish editing that and share it with you so that you can get the full review. I picked this up because I kept hearing about it. It sounded so interesting. It was compared to The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, and also compared to Octavia E. Butler. Octavia E. Butler is one of my favorite authors of all time. The Handmaid's Tale was pretty foundational to me. I read it in high school as a bonus assigned reading from my teacher for extra credit, and kind of exploded my brain and perspective on the world in a bunch of ways. And this is a debut. So those were some pretty big claims and comparisons. And this is set in a near future or sort of modern day alternative United States where there was a second civil war and slavery has returned in a slightly different form, where Black girls and women are owned and have no agency. And our protagonist, Solène, is a young Black girl who is living in this system and has never known anything else. And she happens to catch the eye of a very powerful government official, and her whole life changes in very complicated ways. And I can see the comparisons to The Handmaid's Tale. It's definitely inspired by The Handmaid's Tale in many ways, but it also is very much its own thing, especially because it is specifically talking about the intersections of gender and race. It is specifically exploring misogynoir. But I gave this 4 stars. And you'll have to watch that reading vlog that I will definitely edit and put out soon to know my thoughts on those comparisons at the end of the day to The Handmaid's Tale and to Octavia E. Butler. What a wild comparison to set up for a debut author. Okay, getting into March. Are you still with me? It's starting to get late here and I'm running out of steam, so let's get through these final books. In March, the first book I finished was A Case of Life and Limb by Sally Smith. This is another cozy mystery. One of the other few cozy mysteries I feel like I've read in the last couple of years that doesn't rely on a bunch of stereotypes all over the place. This is the second book in a series. I enjoyed the first book, Of Mice and Murder, I think it was called. This is historical fiction, historical cozy mystery. Our protagonist is a lawyer, and he keeps having these mysteries drop in his lap and having to solve them. Getting involved, even though he just wants to live his quiet life and be a lawyer. The protagonist in these books has OCD, and I can't speak to the portrayal not having OCD myself, but it did feel like the author had done research and was trying to be respectful in the portrayal. While I do think that this series has a lot less relying on stereotypes and bigotry than other cozy mysteries I've read, this book did have more misogyny and slut-shaming than the first book, in part just because of this specific case that Gabriel, our protagonist, is lawyering for. I was going to say adjudicating, but isn't that what the judge does? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. That he is prosecuting, defending. He's the defense. Anyway, but it is coming from characters who we are meant to disagree with. It's meant to be bad that they are being misogynistic and slut-shaming, so there's that. There was a little bit of fat phobia in this book in the portrayal of one pretty minor side character, but I did want to highlight that. It was totally unnecessary, didn't have to be there. I do think overall the book was quite easy to read, pretty enjoyable overall. I do like Gabriel a lot as a protagonist. This book has a cat in it, and I really like cats. I don't know. I find it hard to talk about cozy mysteries at great depth because I tend to listen to cozy mysteries to fall asleep at night. And they're probably the genre that I have the least investment in, or I read the least critically, but I also don't read cozy mysteries that often. I generally liked it. I would recommend this series if you're looking for a cozy mystery series. I think they're only the first 2 books out right now, but I gave it 4 stars. Then we had our book club pick for February, which was Death of the Author by Nnedi Okorafor. I'm a big Nnedi Okorafor fan. I've read several of her books and I'm a fan. I really like how she writes. I really like her ideas. And this one was no different. This is the story of a novelist whose debut novel kind of blows up, and she's tried this new genre. She's tried sci-fi for the first time, and it's become this really big hit, and it sort of changes her whole life. And also we're following, alternating between the author's experience as this Nigerian American author with her family and her dynamic with her family. She's also disabled, and seeing how her family treats her and her disability is a big part of her storyline in the present day. And then we also get chapters that are from the book she wrote that is a sci-fi story about robots. And this was a really interesting book. I found it quite emotional. This had an unexpected loss of a character and dealt with grief that I did not expect going into it. And it turns out the author started writing the book in the wake of a loss of her own and while she was grieving. And that was a much bigger theme in the book than I expected going into it. And I found it very well explored and also very emotional. And it made me cry many times. And I felt very seen by the passages on grief, but they were also quite hard to read. But in a good way, I could very much relate to them. I thought Zelu was a very interesting protagonist. She is very messy and maybe not the most likable, but I kind of loved her for it. She's very much her own person. She does what she wants. She doesn't let other people's expectations of her alter her choices at all. She doesn't care if people think she can or can't do things. She lives her life as she wants to, and sometimes that puts other people off. Sometimes people are turned off by her independence and her kind of no fucks given attitude, but I loved it. I loved how truly herself, genuinely herself she was, and sometimes that was a bit abrasive for people. I don't know. I liked Zelu. I think she's a little self-centered or self-focused at times, but I also can kind of understand why she is. She has a pretty complicated relationship with her family. She has a loving relationship with her family, but also kind of a lack of support, and they don't really see her for who she is. There's a bit of an infantilizing quality that comes with her disability and with sort of, tied to ableism of expectations of what she can and can't do as someone who is paraplegic. I thought the themes of disability and autonomy and complex family dynamics were really well explored. I also thought that some of the themes being explored in the story within a story of personhood and creativity and humanity were really interesting, and they sparked a lot of discussion for us in our book club that I think are very relevant right now in all the conversations that we're having about AI, especially in the realm of authorship and the publishing world. So we had some interesting discussions in our book club meeting about that, and I don't I'm still not 100% sure what I think Okafor was trying to say with that part of the book, and perhaps it's meant to be very open-ended for the reader to sort of perceive in their own way and think through those ideas. But I think for me, what really landed the most was the present day story of Zelu as an author and her experience, her grief, her journey. And once again, I forgot that I own a physical copy and I could have been holding it this time. I think there were aspects of this that were maybe a little bit less focused than I have found some of her other work to be, but I couldn't help but love it and find it so fascinating, and I was deeply, deeply immersed in it. So I gave Death of the Author 5 stars, and I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts in the comments if you've read this, especially about what you feel that Nnedi Okorafor was saying about authorship and creativity and who is able to write stories. And I won't say anything else because I don't want to spoil anything, but we had some debates in our meeting. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts. Next is a book that I read for a reading vlog, and I have a dedicated reading vlog just for this book. So I'm barely going to talk about it because you can go watch that video and get the most in-depth review ever. The Everlasting by Alex E. Harrow. I picked this up because I was really looking for a romantasy I could love, and y'all kept telling me, read that book. Read The Everlasting. Oh my God, why are you reading anything else? Read The Everlasting. So I did, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. Not to spoil you for that reading vlog, but go watch it because I worked hard on it and I think it's a good video. And this is a very good book, and you can watch it and skip the spoiler sections if you haven't read it yet and just hear my thoughts in detail without spoilers. Or if you've read it, you can hear all my spoiler thoughts. How fun is that? Anyway, I really loved this. I loved the characters. I loved the world building. I loved the romance. I loved the sidekicks. I loved the writing style. It made me cry a bunch of times. There were some minor complaints I had here and there that I talk about in the reading vlog, but overall, this was really, really, really great. And it put me in a huge reading slump because it was very good. And I felt drained afterwards in the best way. And I didn't want to read anything else. And I didn't want to think about any other characters. And I felt hungover for a long time after. So that's The Everlasting, 5 stars. Go watch that reading vlog and also read this book. That's it. Next is the third and final book in my Reading Around the World challenge reading vlog, the first one that I just posted recently, so go watch that if you missed it. Notes of a Crocodile by Chu Miao-jin, and I loved this. Again, I will try to be brief because this video is probably so long, and again, I just posted a reading vlog where I got in depth, in detail. This is a Taiwanese classic. This is a queer classic of Taiwanese literature. This is a bit of a cult classic, and I can see why. It was fantastic. It's a little experimental, a little strange. The main plot is following our protagonist, who is at a prestigious university in Taipei, and she's discovering her sexuality and falling in love and making friends with lots of other queer kids. And it was very relatable for someone who went to theater school and had a lot of those kinds of friendships in that time period of my life. And it also is interspersed with these absurd chapters that are an extended metaphor for the experience of living as a queer person, that is about a personified talking crocodile who wears human skin when they go out and about so that they won't be perceived to be a crocodile and get too much attention, but they really like being at home and taking baths. And I don't want to say too much more. I don't want to say too much more. Does that sound weird? It is weird. It's also very tender and endearing and wholesome and made me feel very seen, and I loved it. And it's also beautifully written and has a strong sense of place. And I can totally understand why it became such an important piece of queer literature in the 80s. And I loved it a lot. And that's all I'm going to say. Go watch that reading vlog if you want more details, with or without spoilers. Choose your own adventure. But Notes of a Crocodile was a 5-star read for me. Then I listened to a thriller on audiobook, mostly because I was still in a pretty heavy reading slump from The Everlasting, and I thought a thriller would help. It didn't really help because I didn't like this book very much. I listened to How to Survive in the Woods by Kat Rosenfield. And I think I had this as a Libro FM influencer copy, so thank you to Libro FM. Go check them out. If you want audiobooks, you can support local indie bookstores through your audiobook purchases, which is very cool. And I love Libro FM. But anyway, and this is a thriller set in the woods, as you might expect from the title, and sort of everyone is who knows who's lying and who's gonna double cross who. And this didn't work for me. There are bisexual characters in this book, but I think the bisexual rep is pretty terrible. There's a lot of internalized homophobia and a lot of reinforcing of terrible stereotypes around bisexual people that are not pushed back against at all. I really didn't appreciate the representation of the queer characters. I felt like they were portrayed to have very stereotypical traits of bisexual people that are negative, and it's not just that they were flawed, realistic queer characters, it's that they were portrayed as being evil or bad or terrible in ways that mirror very harmful stereotypes around bisexual people, and I just really didn't appreciate that at all. I also felt like a lot of basic details were underexplained or underexplored. Some things felt very convenient. There's a lot of baiting and teasing and tricking of the reader from the author or from the protagonist. I guess it's meant to be an unreliable narrator sort of feeling, but it mostly just feels like the author is not respecting the reader at all and just constantly changing the facts whenever she feels like it. I found it pretty subpar all around in both the execution and the representation, and all the characters were terrible people. I think I originally gave it 2 stars, but that feels very generous. And honestly, thinking about it now, I don't know what I was thinking, because this is 100% a 1-star read for me. So yeah, 1 star for this. I did not like this at all. With a little bit more distance, I like it even less. I don't think it's worth reading, unfortunately. So that was that. Then I read the entire Hunger Games trilogy by Suzanne Collins for the first time in almost 20 years, and the second time ever. And I have a whole reading vlog. Again, choose your own adventure. You can skip spoilers if you want to, or you can watch all the way through and get all the spoilery thoughts. You probably know what these books are about, and you've also probably read them. So all I'm going to say is I really liked all 3 of them. I gave them 5 stars, 4 stars, and 5 stars. I guess it's an unpopular opinion for Catching Fire to be my least favorite of the 3. I really like it still. It was a very high 4-star, but I did have a few critiques, mostly about the actual structure, pacing, craft of the story and how it was packaged, more so than the story itself. More of a meta critique, I guess. But all 3 were great. I enjoyed them more than I expected to, rereading them as an adult, and I had a good time. So go check out that reading vlog if you want more details, but this was fun. So then for something light and fluffy, the last book I read in March, and the last book I'll review in this video, was The Trial by Franz Kafka. This is a book that my wheel chose for me for my Read It or Haul It challenge, and it will be included in a reading vlog. It's the first book in the next reading vlog, so it's not out yet, but it will be out at some point, and I will link it once it is. This is the story of Joseph K., who has been put under arrest, but no one will tell him what for, and then he has to proceed to undergo a trial. But again, no one will tell him what he is being accused of. And it's very absurd. It kind of feels like a nightmare. It's existential literature. It's quite short, but it's also quite intense and draining and dreary and bleak. And there's a lot of commentary on bureaucracy, existentialism, the meaning of life or the meaninglessness of life, why we're here, life under an authoritarian government. There's a lot of absurdity and satire and strangeness and themes of guilt and paranoia and responsibility and helplessness, mortality, existential dread. This is a book that I found very interesting, but it is also an unfinished work that was compiled and published posthumously and against Kafka's wishes. And it does feel a little bit unfinished and a little choppy, presumably in sections where things were not finished or linked together. It's also very dense and very depressing. I thought it was interesting. I appreciated it. I'm glad I read it, but I probably will never read it again or will wait a very long time to read it again. And it did not leave me in a great place. It was quite a tough read mentally, and I ended up giving it 4 stars. So that's the last book I read in March, and those are all 41, I think, books that I read in the first quarter of 2026. I'm losing my voice. It's getting late, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thanks for watching. Check out all of the many reading vlogs and review videos where I go into even more detail if you want longer reviews. Many of these books I have quite long, detailed reviews of, including optional spoiler sections if you're into that. So check out the links in the description box. It will all be organized for you and listed because I have your back. And watch out for the reading vlogs that are on the way. I am working on them. And leave a star emoji down below if you made it all the way to the end, so I know you're a real one, and I can feel like I'm getting a gold star for getting through this, because this was quite the endeavor. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you. Like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you very soon in my next one. Bye, friends.